At my 70th birthday party in front of all her friends, my daughter-in-law raised a glass and said, "I've been disgusted with you since day one." A shocked silence fell over the room. Everyone looked at me, this poor, humiliated old woman, expecting me to cry. I didn't. I just smiled, took a slow sip of my champagne and let her think she had won. She had no idea that her little performance had just given me the moral authority to take away the one thing she truly loved, my son's inheritance. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. My name is Genevieve Porter, and for 20 years, I was the picture of quiet dignity in the face of my daughter-in-law's disrespect. This is the story of the night she finally went too far, and the morning I decided to reclaim my power. There is a certain kind of quiet elegance that settles over the old houses in Hyde Park, Chicago. It's in the rustle of the oak leaves on a windy autumn day, in the warm glow of the gas lamps at dusk, in the dignified silence of the university libraries. For 70 years, this neighborhood had been my world, and I, Genevieve Porter, had tried to live a life that reflected its quiet, intellectual grace. I was a retired university registrar, a widow, and a woman who found more comfort in a well-bound book than in a well-timed piece of gossip. My late husband, David, had been a professor at the University of Chicago, a man whose mind was as brilliant as his heart was kind. Together we had built a life of the mind, a life of quiet purpose, a life that was, above all else, respectable. My home was a reflection of that life. It was a beautiful old graystone, filled with books, with art, with the comfortable, well-loved furniture we had collected over 45 years of marriage. It was a house of quiet dignity. My daughter-in-law, Kimberly, despised it. Kimberly was a woman who was allergic to quiet. She was loud, she was flashy, she was a creature of the North Shore, that glittering, wealthy stretch of suburbs where the houses were new, the cars were foreign, and the women were all a uniform size too. She had been a real estate agent before she married my son, David Jr., and she had the aggressive, predatory charm of someone who is always trying to close a deal. Her marriage to my son was, in my private opinion, the most successful deal she had ever closed. David Jr. was a good man, a successful financial analyst, but he had inherited his father's gentle spirit without his father's steel spine. He was a man who would do anything for a quiet life, a man who was completely and totally intimidated by his wife's loud, demanding, and deeply insecure personality. The tension between me and Kimberly was a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of our family life. It was a clash of cultures, of values, of two fundamentally different ways of being in the world. I valued discretion. She valued attention. I valued history. She valued novelty. I valued character. She valued brand names. She saw my quiet academic life not as a choice but as a failure. She saw my home with its old books and its comfortable worn furniture as a dusty, embarrassing relic. She saw me, her mother-in-law, as a walking, talking judgment on her own more flashy, more superficial, and, in her eyes, more successful lifestyle. She would come to my home for holidays, her eyes scanning my living room with a barely concealed look of pity and contempt. "Genevieve," she'd say, the name always sounding a little too formal, a little too sharp on her tongue. "Have you ever thought of just updating things? A little gray paint, some new furniture. It would really brighten up the space." I would just smile my quiet, polite smile. "I like my space just the way it is, Kimberly. It's full of memories." "Memories don't increase your property value," she'd sniff, turning away to check her phone. My son would just stand there, a pained, apologetic look on his face, and say nothing. His silence, his constant, unwavering refusal to confront his wife's casual cruelty, was a source of a deep, quiet pain in my heart. I was the queen of Hyde Park in my own small, quiet way. I had my friends, my book club, my position on the board of the local library. I had a life of dignity and respect. But in the presence of my daughter-in-law, I was always made to feel like a dowdy, provincial old woman who just didn't understand the modern world. She was the new, glittering queen, and I was the dowager, a relic to be tolerated but not respected. The Cold War had been going on for 20 years. I had no idea she was about to escalate it into a full-blown public declaration of war. My 70th birthday was approaching, a milestone I had hoped to mark with a quiet dinner with a few close friends. Perhaps a trip to the symphony. A simple, elegant acknowledgement of a life well lived. Kimberly, of course, had other plans. 70, she had shrieked over the phone, her voice a high-pitched theatrical thing. Genevieve, we have to do something fabulous. Big party. A real celebration. I knew immediately that this was not about me. It was about her. A party for me was a social opportunity for her. It was a chance to gather her own friends, to show off her wealth, her taste, her status as the benevolent, loving daughter-in-law to her distinguished, university-connected mother-in-law. It was a performance, and I was to be the guest of honor and the primary prop. Kimberly, dear, I said, my voice calm, trying to head off the inevitable. That's very thoughtful of you. But I really don't want a fuss. A small dinner is all I want. Nonsense, she chirped, completely ignoring my words. You only turned 70 once. We have to do it right. I'm thinking a private room at one of the new restaurants in the West Loop. I'll handle everything. You just have to show up and look fabulous. I tried to protest, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a teacup. She had already decided. The party was happening. I spoke to my son, David Jr., hoping he would intervene. David, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I don't want this party. It's not me. It's for her. Oh, Mom, he'd sighed, his voice full of a weary resignation. Just let her do it. You know what she's like when she gets an idea in her head. It's easier to just go along with it. It'll make her happy. It'll make her happy. The 4 words that had become the guiding principle of my son's life. His wife's happiness was the sun around which his entire world revolved, and the rest of us, his own mother included, were just minor planets, expected to stay in our designated orbits and not cause any trouble. So I reluctantly agreed. I would endure the party. I would play my part. I would smile and accept the accolades, all for the sake of keeping the fragile, tense peace in my family. The party, as Kimberly began to plan it, quickly morphed from a celebration of my life into a celebration of her life. The guest list was the first and most obvious sign. I had given her a small list of 20 names. My closest friends, my brother, a few old colleagues from the university. Oh, that's a good start, she'd said, barely glancing at the list. But we need to flesh it out a bit. I have to invite the Hendersons, of course. And the Barclays. And all the parents from the lacrosse team. It would be rude not to. The guest list swelled to over 100 people, 90 of whom were her friends, her contacts, her social circle. My own life was to be a small, quiet footnote at my own birthday party. The venue she chose was a sleek, minimalist restaurant with concrete floors and a menu that I couldn't understand. The invitations were thick, expensive cardstock, engraved in a font that was barely legible. The theme, she announced, was modern elegance. It was all a weapon, a carefully chosen arsenal of taste and status, designed to highlight her own sophistication and, by extension, my own supposed lack of it. It was a party that was designed to make me feel like a stranger in my own celebration, a guest in my own life. And as the date grew closer, a new, more insidious phase of her campaign began. The campaign to improve me. With the party now a certainty, a great, glittering battleship on the horizon of my quiet life, Kimberly's focus shifted from the logistics of the event to the logistics of me. In her eyes, I was the one variable that could not be controlled, the one element that threatened to clash with the perfect modern elegance of her production. And so she began the campaign of suggestions. Started with my wardrobe. Genevieve, she said, her voice a smooth, concerned purr as we sat in my living room one afternoon. We need to talk about your outfit for the party. I was thinking something modern, something chic. That little black dress you have is lovely, of course, but it's a bit dated. It's a classic, Kimberly, I said, my voice cool. It's a Chanel. They don't go out of date. Of course, she said, waving a dismissive hand. But the silhouette is just not right for the venue. I've taken the liberty of having my personal shopper at Neiman Marcus pull a few options for you. They're being sent over tomorrow. Just something a little more current. She was not suggesting, she was instructing. She was telling me that my own taste, my own style, was not acceptable for her party. The next front in her campaign was my friends. She looked over the small list I had given her, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowing with a theatrical concern. This is a lovely list, Genevieve, she said. So many professors. She said the word professors, as if it were a slightly embarrassing medical condition. But are you sure they'll enjoy themselves? The restaurant is very loud, the music is very modern. It might not be their scene. My friends are perfectly capable of enjoying themselves, Kimberly, I said, my patience wearing thin. I'm just thinking of them, she said, her voice dripping with a false sincerity. I wouldn't want them to feel uncomfortable. Perhaps it would be better to have a separate, smaller luncheon for them here at the house. Something more their speed. She was trying to edit my life, to curate my guest list, to ensure that my quiet academic world did not intrude upon her flashy, superficial one. The final and most insulting front was my home. She had decided to have a small pre-party cocktail hour at my house for a select group of her most important guests, the inner circle, as she called them. And my house, in her eyes, was not ready for its close-up. We just need to make a few small tweaks, she announced, walking through my living room like a general surveying a battlefield, to make it more party-friendly. The tweaks involved her coming over with a team of assistants and systematically stripping my home of its personality. My beloved comfortable armchairs were replaced with rented, modern, uncomfortable ones. My collection of antique maps was taken down from the walls, replaced by large abstract canvases of meaningless, colorful blobs. My family photos, the ones on the mantelpiece of me and David and a young, happy David Jr., were put away in a drawer. It's just for the night, Genevieve, she'd said, seeing the look of horror on my face. We need the space to feel clean, impersonal. Like an art gallery. She was turning my home into a stage, a neutral backdrop for her own performance. She was erasing me, my history, my very identity, all for the sake of a 2-hour cocktail party. Through it all, my son was a ghost. He would watch these small daily humiliations, his face a mask of pained, helpless apology, but he would say nothing. He would not defend my home, my friends, or my dignity. He had ceded that ground to his wife years ago. I was beginning to feel like a stranger in my own life, a character in a play that Kimberly was writing and directing. And I was being given my lines, my costume, my blocking. I was being told how to act, how to dress, and who to be. The campaign of suggestions was not about making the party a success. It was about making me a success in her eyes. It was about turning me into someone she was not ashamed of. It was a battle for my own soul, and I was beginning to feel like I was losing. In the midst of this quiet, cold war, an unexpected ally emerged from behind enemy lines. My granddaughter Maya. Maya was 16, a quiet, observant girl who had inherited her father's gentle spirit and, I like to think, a little of my own thoughtful, academic nature. She was a stark contrast to her mother's loud, glittering world. While Kimberly was all surface, Maya was all depth. She was a reader, a thinker, a girl who always seemed to be watching, listening, and understanding far more than she let on. She had been a quiet, unhappy witness to her mother's campaign against me. I would see the look in her eyes when Kimberly would make one of her cutting suggestions, a flicker of shame, of a deep adolescent embarrassment for her own mother's behavior. The warning came on a Tuesday afternoon, a week before the party. I was in my study trying to read, but the words were just a blur on the page. My house was filled with the scent of lilies, a massive funereal arrangement that Kimberly had delivered, another part of her party staging. My phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. Grandma? It's Maya. Can you talk? I'm using a friend's phone. My heart gave a little lurch. I texted back a simple, yes, and a moment later my phone rang. Maya, sweetheart, I said, my voice a low whisper. Is everything all right? No, Grandma, she said, her own voice a hushed, urgent thing. It's not. It's about Mom. It's about the party. She told me she was calling from her friend's house, that her own mother monitored her phone and her texts. She had to talk to me. She had to warn me. Grandma, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and a deep, painful shame. I heard her on the phone with one of her friends last night. They were talking about you. About the party. She took a shaky breath. She was laughing, Grandma. She was telling her friend that she was so stressed out because she had to manage you for the party. She said that you were a sweet but hopelessly provincial old woman, and that your friends were all dusty old academics. She said she was terrified that you would say something to embarrass her in front of her important guests. The words, a secret, unfiltered glimpse into Kimberly's true feelings, were a fresh, painful wound. And then she said the worst part, Maya continued, her voice cracking. She said, honestly, the woman is an embarrassment. But the family trust is in her brother's name, so I have to play nice. It's all just a performance. And then she laughed. An embarrassment. A performance. The ugly, unvarnished truth of it all. It wasn't just that she was ashamed of me. It was that her entire relationship with me, every kind word, every thoughtful gesture, was a calculated act, a long-term investment strategy designed to ensure her access to the Porter family money. And Grandma, Maya whispered, her voice full of a desperate urgency. She's planning something for the toast. She kept saying to her friend, I'm going to finally put her in her place once and for all. Just you watch. I don't know what it is, but it's not good. She's been drinking a lot lately. She's out of control. A granddaughter's warning. A secret message from the heart of the enemy camp. It was a confirmation of everything I had suspected, but it was also so much worse. Thank you for telling me, Maya, I said, my own voice surprisingly calm. The pain was there, a deep, cold stone in my chest. But my granddaughter's courage, her loyalty, had given me something else. It had given me a new resolve. You are a good and honorable young woman. Your grandfather would be so proud of you. We spoke for a few more minutes and then she had to go. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my study, the scent of Kimberly's funereal lilies thick in the air. She was planning to humiliate me. At my own birthday party. In front of her friends. She thought I was a weak provincial old woman who would just sit there and take it. She thought I was an embarrassment. She was about to learn that there is nothing more formidable, nothing more dangerous, than a woman of quiet dignity who has finally been pushed too far. The warning had been delivered. And now I could prepare for the battle to come. The night of the party arrived, a cold, clear, starless night in Chicago. I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, dressed in the sleek, modern, and ridiculously expensive dress that Kimberly's personal shopper had sent over. It was a beautiful dress, I had to admit, but it felt like a costume. It was not me. I was an actress preparing for a role I did not want to play. The pre-party cocktail hour at my house was a surreal, out-of-body experience. I watched as Kimberly's friends, a flock of loud, confident women in expensive jewelry, moved through my home, a home that had been stripped of my personality and turned into a sterile, generic event space. They drank champagne, they laughed too loudly, and they treated me with a kind of polite, dismissive curiosity, as if I were a museum piece that had been brought out for the occasion. Then we were all whisked away in a fleet of black cars to the restaurant downtown. It was just as I had imagined. A vast, cavernous space with concrete floors, exposed ductwork, and a noise level that was a physical assault. The music was a relentless, thumping beat that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. We were seated at a long banquet-style table. I was at the head, the guest of honor, with my son on one side and my best friend, Loretta, on the other. Loretta had taken one look at the scene and had leaned over to me, her voice a low, furious whisper. This isn't a party, Genevieve. It's an ambush. And that daughter-in-law of yours is the lead assassin. Kimberly was in her element. She was the star of the show, flitting from guest to guest, her laughter a high, bright, and constant sound. She was drinking champagne at an alarming rate, her cheeks flushed, her eyes a little too bright. I could see the nervous, manic energy coming off her in waves. Maya's warning echoed in my mind. She's planning something for the toast. The dinner was a series of small, unidentifiable dishes served on large, square plates. The conversation was a blur of names I didn't know and topics I didn't care about. I just sat there, a quiet, smiling island of calm in a sea of noise and superficiality. And then it was time for the toast. Kimberly stood up, a fresh glass of champagne in her hand. She tapped her glass with a knife, the sharp, clear sound cutting through the din of the restaurant. A hush fell over the table. 100 pairs of eyes turned to her. She started off well enough, her voice a little slurred, but her words practiced and smooth. I just want to thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate a truly momentous occasion, she began, beaming at her audience. My mother-in-law, Genevieve's 70th birthday. She turned to me, a wide, brilliant, and utterly false smile on her face. Genevieve, she said, her voice dripping with a syrupy, theatrical affection. A woman of quiet dignity. A woman from another time, really. A time of books and tea and, well, quiet. A few of her friends tittered. It was a backhanded compliment, a subtle dig, but it was just the opening salvo. When I first met Genevieve 20 years ago, she continued, her voice taking on a new, sharper edge, I was intimidated. I was a young woman from the suburbs and she was this Grand Dame of Hyde Park. The university registrar. So smart. So proper. She said the word proper as if it were a dirty word. I tried so hard to impress her, she said, her voice now a mocking self-pitying whine. I tried to be the daughter-in-law she wanted. But it was never enough. My clothes were too loud. My friends were too fun. My dreams were too big. I was never quiet enough for her. She took a long dramatic sip of her champagne. The mood at the table had shifted. The polite smiles had frozen on the faces of her guests. They knew as I did that this was no longer a toast. It was an attack. And then she let the mask slip completely. Her face, which had been all smiles, twisted into a snarl of pure, ugly, drunken resentment. The 20 years of insecurity, of jealousy, of feeling judged by my quiet dignity, all of it came pouring out in a torrent of venom. She raised her glass high in the air. So I would like to make a toast, she said, her voice now a loud, slurring and deeply unpleasant thing. To Genevieve. A woman I have tolerated for 20 years. She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes locking on mine. Honestly, she screamed, the word a shriek that echoed through the silent, horrified restaurant. I've been disgusted with you since day one. The public insult had been delivered. The grenade had been detonated. And in the ringing, deafening silence that followed, every single person at that table, turned to look at me, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a horrified, fascinated anticipation. They were waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for the tears. They were waiting for me to fall apart. The silence in the restaurant was a physical thing. It was a thick, heavy blanket of shock and second-hand embarrassment that had smothered the entire room. The clinking of glasses from other tables had stopped. The murmur of distant conversations had ceased. It felt as if every person in that vast, cavernous space was holding their breath, their eyes fixed on me, the old woman who had just been publicly, brutally, and inexplicably savaged by her own daughter-in-law. Kimberly stood there, swaying slightly, a look of triumphant, drunken malice on her face. She had done it. She had finally said the ugly, secret thing she had been holding on to for 20 years. She had detonated her bomb, and she was waiting with a greedy, desperate anticipation to see the carnage. My son, David Jr., was a portrait of horrified paralysis. His face was ashen, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from his wife to me and back again, his eyes wide with a look of pure, impotent terror. He was a man trapped in a nightmare of his own making, a nightmare he had allowed to fester for 2 decades through his own cowardly silence. My best friend, Loretta, who was sitting to my left, was a coiled spring of pure, unadulterated rage. Her hand was gripping my arm under the table, her knuckles white, and I could feel the tremor of her fury vibrating through her body. I knew that in another moment she was going to rise to her feet and unleash a torrent of academic, sociological, and deeply profane invective upon Kimberly that would have peeled the paint from the walls. But before she could, I gave her hand a gentle, calming squeeze. Not yet, the squeeze said. Wait. I did not cry. I did not gasp. I did not flinch. The initial searing pain of the insult had been immediately cauterized by a cold, clarifying anger. An anger that was so pure and so absolute that it had the paradoxical effect of making me feel completely, utterly calm. I looked at my daughter-in-law, at her sneering, hate-filled face. I saw her not as a monster but as what she was. A deeply insecure, deeply unhappy, and deeply pathetic woman. A woman whose own self-loathing was so profound that she had to try and destroy the quiet dignity of others to feel powerful. And in that moment of absolute clarity, I knew that the greatest weapon I had against her was not my anger, but my composure. To react with tears or with rage would be to give her exactly what she wanted. It would be to validate her attack, to prove that she had the power to wound me. And I would not give her that satisfaction. So, I did something that no one in that room expected. I smiled. It was not a pained, forced smile. It was a calm, serene, and utterly enigmatic smile. The smile of a queen who is mildly amused by the tantrum of a court jester. I slowly, deliberately picked up my own glass of champagne. I raised it a few inches from the table, a quiet, elegant gesture of acknowledgement. I held her gaze, my smile never wavering. And then I took a slow, deliberate, and deeply satisfying sip of the cool, bubbling liquid. I placed the glass back on the table with a soft, quiet clink. And then I spoke. My voice was not a whisper. It was not a shout. It was clear, it was steady, and it carried through the silent room with an unshakable, quiet authority. "Thank you for your honesty, Kimberly," I said, my voice as smooth as silk. "It's so clarifying." The effect of those 5 simple words was more devastating than any scream could have been. My refusal to be a victim, my calm, almost amused acceptance of her brutal insult, had completely unnerved her. It was a move she had not anticipated. She had expected a scene. She had expected a victory. Instead, I had given her an enigma. I had taken her grenade and calmly, gracefully, handed it right back to her. The spell was broken. The room erupted in a flurry of hushed, frantic activity. People started to push back their chairs, to murmur apologies. The party was over. It had died right there on the concrete floor, a casualty of Kimberly's own self-immolation. David Jr. finally seemed to snap out of his paralysis. He rushed to his wife's side, his face a mask of shame and panic, and began to steer her away from the table, her drunken, stumbling protests drowned out by the rising murmur of the crowd. Loretta leaned over to me, her eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated admiration. "Genevieve Porter," she whispered, her voice a low, appreciative growl. "You are, without a doubt, the most magnificent woman I have ever known." I just smiled my enigmatic smile and took another sip of my champagne. The party had been a disaster. But the war, I knew, had just turned in my favor. She had shown her hand. She had revealed her character to the world. And she had just given me all the ammunition I would ever need. The party did not just end, it imploded. It was a social supernova, and the fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Kimberly. She and David Jr. fled the restaurant in a flurry of shame and recrimination, leaving a room full of their stunned, horrified guests to whisper and dissect the spectacular public self-destruction they had just witnessed. Loretta and I, on the other hand, made a graceful, quiet exit. We allowed one of our old professor friends to drive us home, and we sat in the back of the car in a comfortable, companionable silence. There was nothing to say. Not yet. The next morning, my house, which had been so recently violated by Kimberly's staging and her superficial friends, became a sanctuary again. It became a council room. My war council. Loretta arrived first, a bag of fresh pastries from our favorite Hyde Park bakery in one hand and a look of grim, righteous determination on her face. "Okay," she said, setting the bag on my kitchen table. "The pity party is officially over. Today we plan the counteroffensive." My granddaughter, Maya, arrived a few minutes later. She had taken the early train from the city, her face pale with a mixture of shame and a fierce, protective loyalty. She threw her arms around me, her hug a silent, heartfelt apology for her mother's behavior. "Grandma," she whispered, "I am so sorry. I knew she was planning something, but I never imagined it would be that horrible." "It's not your fault, sweetheart," I said, holding her tight. "You were brave enough to warn me. And that made all the difference." The final member of our council arrived at precisely 10 o'clock. My older brother, Robert. Robert Porter was 75 years old, a retired investment banker, and a man who was as pragmatic and powerful as I was quiet and academic. He was a man of few words, but his words carried the weight of a lifetime of success and an unshakable moral authority. He was also the sole trustee of the Porter Family Trust, a fact that was about to become critically important. He walked into my living room, his face a grim, unreadable mask, and simply said, "Loretta told me what happened. Tell me what you want me to do, Genevieve." And so our council of war began. We sat in my living room, the four of us, a strange and powerful alliance. Loretta, the best friend, the confidant, was the voice of righteous fury. "We have to destroy her, Genevieve," she said, her voice a low growl. "Not just embarrass her. We have to systematically dismantle her entire fraudulent life. We have to take away her platform, her friends, her money. We have to leave her with nothing but her own ugly, pathetic self." Maya, the granddaughter, the inside source, was the voice of intelligence. She gave us a clear, painful, and invaluable insight into her mother's motives, into her deep-seated insecurities, into the fragile, social media-fueled world she had built for herself. "She's terrified of being seen as less than," Maya explained, her voice quiet but firm. "Her entire life is about projecting an image of wealth and success. That's her weakness. If you take that away, she has nothing." And Robert, my brother, the enforcer, was the voice of power. He listened patiently to Loretta's fury and Maya's analysis. And then he looked at me, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Genevieve," he said, his voice calm and steady. "The family trust gives me a great deal of discretionary power. I can't change the terms of the trust, but I can control the flow of the distributions. The question is not what we can do. The question is what you want to do. This is your battle. We are just your soldiers. You have to give us our marching orders." They all looked at me, waiting. For a moment, the weight of it all, the ugliness of the fight to come, felt overwhelming. A part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime avoiding conflict, just wanted it all to go away. But then I thought of Kimberly's face, twisted with a sneering, drunken malice. I thought of the 20 years of her subtle, constant disrespect. I thought of my son, a good man hollowed out by his own weakness. And I thought of my late husband, David, a man of such profound integrity, whose legacy was now tied to this shallow, cruel woman. And I knew I could not let it stand. "I don't want to destroy her, Loretta," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I want to teach her a lesson. A history lesson. A lesson in consequences. I want her to understand that character is more valuable than cash. That dignity is more important than designer clothes. And that you cannot, under any circumstances, build your own house on the ruins of someone else's." I looked at my brother. "Robert," I said, "I think it's time we reminded my daughter-in-law about the terms of our family's generosity. I think it's time we talked about the character and conduct clause." A slow, cold smile spread across my brother's face. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. The Council of War was over. The strategy had been set. The Porter Family Trust was a quiet, formidable entity, much like the man and woman who had created it, my parents. They had been children of the Great Depression, members of the Great Migration, a proud, hardworking black couple who had come to Chicago from Mississippi with nothing and had built a successful business, brick by painful brick. They were not flashy people. They did not believe in unearned wealth or unexamined lives. And the trust they had established for their children and their children's children was a reflection of those values. It was not a simple inheritance. It was a legacy with strings attached. The trust provided a significant annual stipend to both me and my brother Robert. It also provided a smaller but still substantial annual distribution to each of our children's households, a financial cushion designed to ensure that their own children, my grandchildren, would have every opportunity for education and advancement. It was a gift of generational wealth, a concept that my parents had fought and bled for. But they had been wise. They had seen the corrosive effect of unearned money. And so, with their lawyer, they had built a firewall into the very fabric of the trust. A character and conduct clause. I remembered the day my father had explained it to me, his voice firm, his eyes full of a deep paternal wisdom. "This money is not a prize, Genevieve," he had said. "It is a responsibility. It is a tool. And it is only to be entrusted to those who have the character to wield it wisely. It is to be used to build, not to destroy." The clause was simple and powerful. It gave the trustee, my brother Robert, a man whose integrity was as unshakable as my father's, the sole discretionary power to suspend or permanently revoke the distributions to any beneficiary who, in his judgment, had failed to uphold the family's reputation through their personal or professional conduct. It was a moral fail-safe, a way to ensure that the Porter family name would always be associated with dignity, with integrity, and with respect. For 50 years, the clause had been a quiet, dormant piece of legal text, a relic of my parents' old-fashioned values. But now it was about to become the most powerful weapon in our arsenal. After our Council of War, Robert went home and retrieved the original trust documents from his safe. He scanned the relevant pages and emailed them to me. I sat in my study and read the words my father had insisted upon so many years ago, and I felt a profound, chilling sense of his foresight. Distributions are contingent upon the beneficiary's adherence to a standard of conduct that reflects positively upon the Porter family name. This includes, but is not limited to, the demonstration of personal integrity, financial prudence, and the respectful and honorable treatment of all family members, especially the family elders. The respectful and honorable treatment of all family members, especially the family elders. Kimberly, in her drunken public tirade, had not just insulted me. She had violated the foundational principle of the very trust that was funding her lavish, aspirational lifestyle. She had, with her own ugly words, handed us the legal and moral justification to cut her off completely. The plan was simple. Robert, as the trustee, would call a formal meeting with David Jr. and Kimberly. He would inform them that, due to Kimberly's gross misconduct, a direct violation of the character and conduct clause, he was exercising his right as trustee to immediately suspend all financial distributions from the trust to their household. But we needed more. We needed to make sure that David Jr. could not simply smooth things over, could not apologize on his wife's behalf and convince his uncle to turn the money back on. We needed to show that Kimberly's behavior was not a one-time drunken mistake, but a pattern of malicious intent. And that is where my granddaughter, Maya, played her final crucial role. Maya was a child caught between two worlds. She loved her mother, but she was deeply, fundamentally ashamed of her. She loved me, her grandmother, and she was horrified by the way her mother treated me. Her loyalty was torn, and it was a heavy burden for a 16-year-old to carry. But my granddaughter, I was learning, had a spine of steel that her father so conspicuously lacked. After our council of war, she went home with a new, quiet purpose. She knew that her mother, in the aftermath of the disastrous party, would be in a state of high drama, of frantic damage control and self-pitying rants. And she knew that in that state Kimberly would be careless. 2 days later, Maya called me, her voice a hushed, excited whisper. "Grandma," she said. "I got it. I got something you can use." She told me that her mother had been on the phone all day with her best friend, a woman as shallow and materialistic as she was. Kimberly had been recounting the events of the party, not with remorse, but with a kind of proud, defiant glee. She was painting herself as a victim, a woman who had finally stood up to her overbearing, judgmental mother-in-law. And Maya had recorded it. She had been in the adjoining room, supposedly doing her homework, and she had used the voice memo app on her phone to secretly record the entire hour-long conversation. She sent the audio file to me and to her great-uncle Robert. I sat in my study, my hands trembling slightly, and I listened to the recording. It was the most vile, most damning, and most useful thing I had ever heard. Kimberly's voice, stripped of its public charm, was a raw, ugly thing full of venom and a deep, festering resentment. "And then I just said it, Tiffany," she was saying, her voice a triumphant squeal. "I just told her to her face. I've been disgusted with you since day one." You should have seen her face. She just sat there like a frozen old statue. I finally shut her up. For once in her life, she had nothing to say. She went on, bragging about her performance, about how she had finally put the Queen of Hyde Park in her place. But then the conversation took a darker, more sinister turn. "The real problem," Kimberly said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is David. He's so weak. He's always been terrified of her. And he's got all his inheritance tied up with her brother, that old fossil Robert. It's all in that stupid family trust." "So what are you going to do?" her friend asked. "I have a plan," Kimberly said, her voice full of a cunning, greedy confidence. "I'm talking to a lawyer. A new one. We're going to build a case that David Jr. is financially incompetent. That he's too emotionally unstable to manage his own affairs. We'll get me appointed as his financial guardian. And once I have control of his finances, I can go after the trust. I can get him declared the sole beneficiary, and I can cut the old woman and her whole dusty family off completely. It'll take time, but in the end I'll get it all." I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just about disrespect anymore. It was a planned, premeditated financial assault. She was plotting to have my son, her own husband, declared incompetent so she could steal his inheritance. The recording was the final, irrefutable proof of her malicious intent. It was the smoking gun. I called Robert. He had listened to the recording as well. His voice was cold, quiet, and absolutely furious. "That's it," he said. "The meeting is tomorrow. And I am no longer going to be suspending their funds. I am going to be terminating them. Permanently." The secret recording had changed the game. It had escalated the stakes from a family dispute to a case of documented, premeditated financial malice. Kimberly had thought she was just gossiping with a friend. She had no idea she was delivering the closing argument in the trial of her own character. And the verdict was about to come down hard. The emergency meeting was not a negotiation. It was a sentencing. Robert, in his capacity as trustee, summoned David Jr. and Kimberly to his downtown office, a place of quiet old money power with mahogany walls and a view of Lake Michigan. I was not there, but Robert, with a grim satisfaction, recounted the entire scene to me later that day. They had arrived, he said, with two different attitudes. David Jr. looked like a man being led to his own execution, pale, nervous, and deeply ashamed. Kimberly, on the other hand, had come ready for a fight. She walked in with a defiant, arrogant swagger, as if she were the one who had been wronged. Robert didn't waste time with pleasantries. He had them sit at his vast, empty conference table. He sat opposite them, a single thin file folder on the polished wood before him. He began, his voice calm, cold, and utterly devoid of any familial warmth. I have called you here today in my official capacity as the sole trustee of the Porter Family Trust, he said. I am here to inform you of a decision I have made regarding the distribution of funds to your household. Kimberly immediately went on the offensive. If this is about that stupid party, she began, her voice sharp and defensive, then you can save your breath. Genevieve was being judgmental and condescending as usual, and I simply... Robert held up a hand, a quiet, simple gesture that immediately silenced her. This is not about the party, Kimberly, he said, his voice like ice. The party was merely a symptom of a much deeper disease. This is about your character. Or more precisely, your lack of it. He then looked at his nephew. David, he said, his voice full of a deep, sorrowful disappointment. For 20 years, I have watched you allow this woman to disrespect your mother. I have watched you stand by in silence while she has mocked her, belittled her, and treated her with a contempt that is frankly breathtaking. Your silence has been a constant act of betrayal. And for that you should be deeply, profoundly ashamed. David Jr., he said, had simply crumpled, his head in his hands, unable to speak. Robert then turned his attention back to Kimberly. And you, he said, his voice a low, dangerous thing. You are a woman of a singular and very ugly ambition. You married into this family not for love but for money and for status. And you have treated the matriarch of this family, the woman whose good name you were so eager to take, as nothing more than an obstacle and an embarrassment. He paused, letting the words hang in the silent, tense air. I was prepared to come here today and simply suspend your payments, pending a formal apology and a significant change in your behavior. But then I received new information. Information that has made it clear that you are not just disrespectful, but that you are malicious and potentially criminal in your intent. He opened the file folder and slid a small digital audio player across the table. I believe you are familiar with this conversation, he said. He pressed play. And Kimberly's own voice, bragging, vicious, and full of a greedy, triumphant malice, filled the silent, mahogany-paneled room. Her voice, plotting to have her own husband declared incompetent so she could steal his inheritance. Robert said the color drained from her face. She stared at the audio player as if it were a venomous snake, her eyes wide with the horror of a conspirator who has just been betrayed. When the recording was over, Robert pressed stop. The silence that followed was absolute. As the trustee of this fund, he said, his voice a final, irrevocable judgment, I am bound by the terms set forth by my late father. I am bound by the character and conduct clause. And it is my solemn duty to protect the legacy and the integrity of the Porter family name. And you, Kimberly, he said, looking at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt, are a disgrace to that name. Therefore, he announced, his voice ringing with a final, quiet power, effective immediately, I am exercising my full discretionary power as trustee. All financial distributions from the Porter Family Trust to the household of David Porter Jr. and Kimberly Porter are hereby suspended. Indefinitely. The financial guillotine had fallen. The lifeblood of their lavish, aspirational lifestyle had just been severed at the source. The country club, the luxury car, the designer clothes, the very foundation of Kimberly's social standing, it was all gone in an instant. She had come to the meeting ready for a fight. She was leaving it in a state of total, absolute, and richly deserved ruin. The suspension of the trust fund was not a quiet, private affair. It was a financial earthquake, and the aftershocks ripped through every aspect of Kimberly's carefully constructed life with a brutal, unforgiving speed. The money from the Porter Family Trust had been more than just a supplement to their income. It had been the very foundation of their existence. It was the silent, steady river of cash that had allowed them to live a life far beyond what my son's salary as a financial analyst could have ever supported. And now the river had run dry. The first casualty was the country club. The monthly dues which were automatically debited were declined. A polite but firm letter arrived from the club's membership director, informing them that their privileges had been suspended pending payment. The place where Kimberly had held court, where she had networked with the wives of doctors and CEOs, was now a door that was closed to her. The next to go was the car. Her gleaming white luxury SUV was a lease, a ridiculously expensive one. Without the trust fund money to subsidize the payment, it was an impossible extravagance. Within a month the car was gone, replaced by a sensible and, in Kimberly's eyes, deeply humiliating used sedan. Her high-limit credit cards, the tools she had used to build her wardrobe and her social standing, were declined one by one. The shopping sprees, the lavish lunches, the constant casual acquisition of things, it all came to a screeching halt. Her social life, which was built entirely on a foundation of money, evaporated overnight. The friends who had flocked to her parties, who had admired her taste and her seemingly endless resources, suddenly became distant. The invitations stopped coming. The phone calls went unanswered. In the shallow transactional world she had chosen to inhabit, a woman without money was a woman without value. She was a social ghost, haunted by the memory of a life she could no longer afford. The implosion was not just financial and social, it was personal. The marriage, which had been held together by a fragile truce of my son's weakness and his wife's ambition, began to crumble under the new immense pressure. Maya, my granddaughter, would give me quiet, sad updates. The house, she said, was no longer a stage for a perfect life. It was a tense, unhappy battlefield. The arguments were constant and they were always about money. Kimberly, stripped of her social standing and her financial power, became a bitter, resentful shrew. She blamed David Jr. for everything. She blamed him for his weakness, for his loyalty to his awful family, for his inability to provide her with the lifestyle she believed she deserved. David Jr., for his part, was a man in a state of shock. He was finally seeing his wife for who she truly was, not the glamorous, ambitious woman he had married, but a shallow, cruel, and deeply unhappy person. The illusion had been shattered, and he was left with the ugly, uncomfortable reality. The final and most satisfying part of the implosion was the death of her online persona. She tried for a few weeks to maintain the facade, but it was impossible. She had nothing new to post about. No new clothes, no lavish vacations, no glamorous parties. Her feed became a sad, stagnant collection of old photos, a digital museum of a life that was over. Her followers, sensing the inauthenticity, began to drift away. The brand she had so carefully and so cruelly built had died a quiet digital death. She was trapped. Trapped in a marriage that was falling apart, in a social circle that had rejected her, in a life that was a pale, pathetic shadow of the one she had so desperately craved. The implosion was total. And it had all happened without me having to raise my voice, without me having to file a single lawsuit. I had simply stepped back and allowed the natural, brutal consequences of her own character to run their course. The final act of this family tragedy did not belong to me or to Kimberly or even to my brother Robert. It belonged to my son. For the first time in his life, David Jr. was forced out of the comfortable, conflict-avoidant shadows and into the harsh, unforgiving light of a necessary confrontation. Robert, having delivered the financial death blow, made one final strategic move. He called his nephew and laid out the terms of a possible and very conditional surrender. "David," he had said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation, "the situation as it stands is untenable. The trust distributions are suspended. Your wife is a disgrace to this family, and you have a choice to make." He gave him an ultimatum. Not one born of anger like Kimberly's, but one born of a deep familial disappointment and a demand for a return to the values our family was built on. "You have two options," Robert had told him. "Option 1, you do nothing. You continue to enable your wife's behavior. And in that case, the suspension of the trust funds will become a permanent and legal disinheritance. You and she will be cut off from this family financially and personally for the rest of your lives. Option 2, he had continued, is that you become the man your father raised you to be. You take control of your family's finances. You insist non-negotiably that your wife attend counseling for her behavior. And you and she will draft a formal written apology to your mother. An apology that acknowledges the depth of her disrespect and the pain she has caused. If and only if you do these things will I consider a partial and probationary reinstatement of the trust funds. He was forcing my son to choose. To choose between his mother's dignity and his wife's greed. To choose between the values of his family and the toxic demands of his marriage. Took him a week. A week of what I can only imagine were the most difficult, most soul-searching days of his life. A week of what Maya described as a house filled with a tense, heavy silence. And then he made his choice. He came to my house alone. He stood on my doorstep not as the confident, successful financial analyst, but as a small, broken boy. His face was pale, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he was holding a single handwritten envelope. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to explain away his wife's behavior. He just looked at me, his eyes full of a shame so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. For everything. For my silence. For my weakness. For letting this happen. There is no excuse. And I am here to tell you that it is over." He told me he had given Kimberly the ultimatum. He had told her that their life as they knew it was over. That the spending, the social climbing, the constant desperate performance had to stop. He had told her she would go to counseling. He had told her she would co-sign the letter of apology. Or he would file for divorce. And then he handed me the envelope. Inside was a letter written on simple, plain paper. The first half was in his handwriting, a heartfelt, painful and deeply moving apology for his own failings as a son. The second half was in Kimberly's handwriting. It was stiff. It was formal. It was clearly written under duress. But it was there. An admission of her behavior. An apology for her words. It was not the sincere, soul-bearing apology of a woman who had seen the error of her ways. It was the forced, bitter confession of a woman who had been utterly and completely defeated. And for me that was enough. The son's ultimatum had been delivered. The choice had been made. The long Cold War was finally over. The apology was not a magic wand. It did not erase 20 years of disrespect. It did not heal the deep, painful wound that Kimberly's cruelty had carved into our family. But it was a beginning. It was an acknowledgement. It was a foundation upon which something new and hopefully better could be built. David Jr., true to his word, began the slow, difficult process of taking back control of his own life. He and Kimberly started counseling. He took over the family finances, putting them on a strict and for Kimberly deeply humiliating budget. The era of lavish, aspirational spending was over. Robert, in turn, was true to his word. He reinstated a portion of the trust fund distributions, enough for them to live comfortably but not extravagantly. The message was clear. The Porter family money was a safety net, not a blank check for a life of superficiality. But for me, the victory was not in their punishment. It was in the opportunity it created. I had seen the power of the family trust, the power of my parents' legacy to enact change. And I decided it was time to create a legacy of my own. I called my brother Robert. "I have a proposal for you, big brother," I said. I met with him and with my son. I told them that I wanted to amend the terms of the trust. I did not want to restore the full amount of the annual distributions to David Jr. and Kimberly's household. Instead, I wanted to take a significant portion of that money every year and redirect it. And so, we created the Genevieve Porter Scholarship Fund. It was a fund dedicated to a cause that was deeply personal to me. It was designed to provide a full 4-year scholarship to the University of Chicago for one young woman from Chicago's South Side every single year. A young woman who, like me, had a passion for learning, a quiet dignity, and a dream of a life beyond the circumstances she was born into. The first scholarship was awarded the following year. The recipient was a brilliant, ambitious, and deeply grateful young woman who wanted to be a doctor. I sat in the front row at the awards ceremony between my brother and my son, and I watched as she accepted the award, her eyes shining with tears of joy. Kimberly was not there. She had been invited but had declined to attend. The public display of a legacy that was not about her, that was funded by the money she had lost, was a humiliation she could not endure. As I sat there listening to this young woman talk about her dreams, I felt a sense of peace so profound, it was almost overwhelming. My revenge was complete. It had not been a loud, angry, destructive act. It had been a quiet, creative, and generative one. I had taken the ugliness of my daughter-in-law's disrespect, and I had transformed it into a beautiful, powerful, and lasting opportunity for someone else. I had taken the money she had coveted, the money she had tried to secure through cruelty and manipulation, and I had used it to build a new legacy. A legacy of hope. A legacy of strength. A legacy that would honor the Porter family name in a way that Kimberly, with all her money and all her ambition, never could. She had been disgusted with me since day one. She had tried to make me feel small, old, and irrelevant. But in the end, I was the one who had the last word. And my last word was not one of anger but one of grace. I had taken her poison and I had turned it into medicine. And that, I knew, was a victory that would last for generations to come.